Hello, everyone. Welcome back to a new It's a Progressive World interview. And today we have the pleasure of being joined once again by Christian Parenti. Christian, thank you very much for joining us. I'm just going to give a very short introduction to you, and then you can add anything if you want. But you're a professor of economics, a full tenured professor of economics at John Jay College, City University of New York. And of course, you have written a bunch of books, and you have three new articles out which we're going to touch on. So I'm just going to put them on the screen right now. Peter Turchin's False Prophecy, How Lawfare Became Biden's Campaign Strategy. So this one's from June 12th, but we're recording this on the day where the new indictment against Trump have come out, so super relevant. And get the headline here, How Biodefense Mercenaries Endanger Us. So thank you again, Christian, for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks again for having me on the show.
Anything you want to add, or should we get right into it?
No, that's fine. I suppose I should plug my most recent book, Radical Hamilton. That came out in 2020, but that's history. And we're talking current events, so may or may not overlap. But anyway, yeah. So
Perfect. So I was gonna ask you a general question, but Sam has put the question together, linking it to one of your articles as well. So I'll let him go ahead.
You shouldn't have said that, but yeah, you end your article with the article that Camille mentioned is related to now how Lawfare became Biden campaign's strategy. You end your article with war-drunk Democrats don't even notice Trump's pro-peace rhetoric, which during the 4 years of his presidency was matched by relatively pro-peace policy. But I suspect many voters will. So I'm guessing you're thinking he has a relatively good chance in this election. Do you think the indictments, recent developments changed anything, or?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether he has a good chance or not. He's right now he's neck and neck with Biden in most head-to-head polls. He's also got a similar split on favorability and unfavorability rating. So it's not impossible, but there just seems to be so many forces conspiring against him. And these indictments, there's now the fourth case, and like how many individual charges there are, I'm not even clear. I think it's like over 78 different individual charges at this point. It might even be more than that against Trump. He had $100 million legal bill recently. So that wasn't even in the article I wrote about this, but I mean that is going to impact him negatively. He's going to have to appear at a lot of these cases. There's the possibility that he could be found guilty and jailed on some of these charges. So, the approach to this is, common left approach to this is say, well, finally, our leadership class has been criminal for a very long time, and it's about time that there was some accountability. And that's good as far as it goes. That's good as an abstract argument, but you have to view the Trump indictments in their actual context and not in the realm of suppositions about how the political system should work, right? George Bush is not being brought up on charges for, false pretenses to start a horrendous, devastating, region-wrecking war in Iraq, right? But more to the point, we have Hunter Biden and that laptop, and the left has dismissed this entirely. It was only in March of this year, I believe, that the New York Times and the Washington Post even admitted to the existence of this laptop, its reality. And most of the kind of left socialist types, rad lib types that I know have been totally dismissive of, they were totally dismissive of the idea, the veracity of the laptop, until the Times and the Post finally admitted that it was real. And on this laptop, what's important is not the photographs of Hunter doing drugs and cavorting with various women. It's the emails with his business associates, which seem to show quite clearly that he was influence peddling, right? And so the line was, well, Joe Biden says he didn't know anything about Hunter Biden's business dealings, and he never discussed it. But on the laptop is a voicemail from Joe Biden about a New York Times article that mentions Hunter Biden and his business dealings, right? So it's like Joe Biden was lying about that. Now it's come out that, it's clear that Hunter Biden put Joe on the phone at least 20 times when talking with these business partners, and people, defenders of the Bidens, are saying, well, he was just talking about the weather. He wasn't talking about deals. But when you're the vice president of the most powerful country in the world, I mean, that's ipso facto influence peddling. If your son is working on a deal and he says, hey, let's call my dad, who's the vice president of the United States, and he picks up immediately and then discusses the weather with like the top spy chief in China, which apparently that was one instance of this, right? I mean, that's influence peddling. You don't have to
100%.
say how much is the deal. So
no, I think
that stuff on the scale too, right? It's like, it's not, if the Republicans were going after Joe Biden and he was squeaky clean, they had nothing on him, then the argument that, like, look, Trump is dirty, this has to be dealt with, these aren't political charges, would have more weight as far as I'm concerned. But look, the fact of the matter is there's a double standard. They're going after Trump over stuff that seems to be wrong, but a lot of it hinges on like the question of how what was Trump's mens res, his state of mind. Did he know that he was promulgating falsehoods, or did he actually believe what he was saying when he says this election was stolen, you just have to find me 11,000 votes, right? Which is one of the most damning quotes we have from him. And he doesn't say go and invent it. I know we lost, but go and invent 11,000 votes. I mean, his defense would be like, Trump, for fill in the blank reasons, believed there was election tampering, and he did not think that he was
there are votes that are
get someone to he didn't think he was trying to get an elected official in Georgia to commit a crime. He'll argue that he genuinely thought there had been fraud, and he wanted this. It was the Secretary of State of Georgia to expose the fraud, right? That'll be his defense. I mean, that's pretty, it's pretty weak. It's not like it's not out of the case that he won't win on those things. But those charges are pretty weak. It's not like the Hunter Biden case where it's like, and 10% to be paid to the big guy. Yeah. I mean, this stuff is like, and that stuff is being ignored. So you have to look at the Trump indictments in the larger context of the Biden family's set of problems. And when you do that, it starts looking very problematic, very political, like the sitting president is going after his main opponent. And I mean, that is highly problematic.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Do you
I think go ahead.
They just today or yesterday they announced they're gonna make the guy a special counsel. They're gonna give him like the special powers or something. Do you think that makes the change? And secondly, do you think the Gavin Newsom thing, like some people are speculating Democrats are not going to run Biden partially because of the Hunter Biden, partially because he's potentially going to die. So do you think Gavin Newsom, that type of thing has a...
I think that, my understanding of the special counsel of Weiss being made special counsel is that it actually inhibits Congress's ability to bring forward evidence. So Republicans have not welcomed this move, even though Weiss has said, well, now that the plea deal with Hunter Biden, which was a plea deal on these minor charges, right? It was about tax evasion and weapons possession. It was not a plea deal about the substance of much of what's in the laptop, though the plea deal did, and this is what tipped the judge off and why she blew the whole thing up, it did include immunity that would extend to all of these other potential crimes that were revealed by his laptop. So that's why it fell apart. So then Weiss says, well, we're going to have to go to trial, it seems, right? So that sounds tough. But my understanding is that this actually inhibits the Republicans in Congress, their ability to use the information that they're finding. I don't know really all the details on that, so I can't really say definitively much more than that, but that's one interpretation. We'll see we'll see how it goes.
But do you think,
There was
yeah,
some other part of what you asked. What was it?
do you think Democrats gonna run Biden, or maybe because of the,
Yeah,
age
I
and
think that
no?
I think that Biden will run unless he is like actually incapacitated somehow, has a stroke or something like that. I think he's going to run, and I think what Gavin Newsom is doing is, you know, getting on deck for in case there's an open primary because Biden dies or is incapacitated, or he's getting on deck for somewhere down the line. So I don't think there's no like secret command post that can definitively say like, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. I mean, these Democratic and for that matter, Republican Party potentates. They're like barons, they might answer in some respect to whoever is president, but they're all like that, people with titanic egos and tremendous ambitions. And so I think Joe Biden is going to run. He might then step down if he really is slowing cognitively, and Kamala Harris will be president. But I don't think there's any benefit for the Democrats saying, well, Biden is too old, and we're going to now admit that he was essentially too old while he was governing, and we're going to open up against Donald Trump, who's so clearly the front runner. The Republicans, we're going to then open up the primary and have all these Democrats battling each other. There's nothing in that scenario for the Democratic Party. So I think that Biden is going to do his best to run.
Yeah, I'd be
We'll
very
see.
surprised if Biden doesn't run. I mean, if I worked in the Democratic Party, I think I wouldn't take any unnecessary risks. And the easiest thing would be for Biden to run. And yeah, these Trump indictments, if these ones also fall flat on their face, I mean, it'll be great for Trump. I mean, the last one where CNN tried to cover it from the get-go, they just shot for like an hour aerial footage of New York. That was really nice to see, but it didn't lead to anything. But Christian, going back to your article, so I think the main point that you're making here in this article is that the Biden administration is kind of their strategy is to just sit tight and then just try to get Trump into problem due to law issues and not run because and not sorry get into any debates or talk much and all that because that would just create backlash. But you kind of argue that maybe that's not the best idea because the downside of that is that then Biden doesn't get to present his case. But yeah, did I represent it correctly? And
yeah, I think that's right. And then the other downside, which I'm not sure I mentioned that article, is that it's all this free media again. Now the media is very negative, but it's the same problem that everyone recognized last time, that Trump excelled at earned media.
Yeah.
Free coverage, right? And so, I mean, that's been baked in now. You've got 4 cases, however many counts. It's just like it's going to be Trump in the headlines until election day, whether you like it or not. And it's like, that might backfire, and also especially if the cases get complicated and boring, it's not like traumatic that like, wait a minute, in some foreign capital, they had a meeting and a whole bunch of money changing it, like something from a caper movie that you can get your head around. It's like, people droning on about, intentionality and how the law has historically viewed that. I mean, that's boring. And so I think a lot of people just kind of zone out. And then there's the risk of like that the average viewer thinks that they're digging for stuff. They're scraping the bottom of the barrel on stuff. I can't understand these charges. The charges aren't particularly dramatic. They're boring. At first they sound dramatic, but then they boil down to this like bureaucratic nonsense, and people could feel sympathetic. Like, they really are hounding this guy.
Oh,
They
no, for sure.
are picking on him,
For sure. And this time, I think the judge said, if I read correctly, once they indict Trump and all the other ones or have them all in kind of one court procedure, which probably wouldn't be great for TV. I mean, I don't know exactly how that would work out.
Well, they've got state and federal charges. I mean, they might consolidate various overlapping federal charges, but I don't think they would consolidate state and federal charges, but they would. I don't know.
Any other thoughts on the election? I mean, one other thing that comes to my mind is besides Trump, it seems like the Republicans don't really have anyone. DeSantis is not really working out. And any thoughts on characters such as RFK that have popped up, RFK Jr. for this election or anything like that?
Yeah, I have thoughts on RFK, but before that, I think it's important. I don't know if we talked about this last time we all met online, but I did an article for Gray Zone and I did an article for Compact that both dealt with Trump's foreign policy. And I think this is what it's all about. The reason they hate Trump so much, and the reason there's this full court press against Trump, and the reason there was Russiagate, which I think was just a kind of preposterous hoax, basically, is because of his foreign policy, right? If you look at his domestic policy, he gave the ruling class a massive tax cut, and he just went to town on environmental and health and safety regulations, 84% of which by some estimates have been blocked and overturned in judicial review. But, so on the domestic front, he was very good to the ruling class, the elites of this country. So what's the beef? Why do they hate him so much? Because they clearly do hate him. And the answer is in his foreign policy. And he was very hostile to American empire, right? So one of the, so that's what those two articles are that I just mentioned. I mean, stuff he did. He drew down. He attempted to withdraw a third of the troops from Germany. His defense secretary redeployed many of them, but he withdrew almost 20% of the troops, about 20% of the troops from South Korea. And now both of these places are hubs for much wider systems of American military power. So the numbers alone, the percentages are to some extent deceptive. Withdrawing almost a third of the troops from Germany is kind of like taking almost 1/3 of the parts out of an automobile, right? It may or may not run. If you do it right, you can still drive the thing, not legally, but you'll want to have windshields or whatever. So the damage is much greater than the actual percentage of troops. One of the most important events or interesting events is like 6 months into Trump's presidency. And he runs on all this, I'm going to end this forever wars, and the Europeans are ripping us off, and NATO's racket, and all this kind of stuff. And he doesn't drop that during the first 6 months. So his generals have a meeting with him at the Pentagon in this super secret briefing room, and they try to explain to him how American hegemony works, how military deployments and the intelligence system interconnects with trade deals, and just try to explain the entire ecosystem, the entire architecture and structure of post-World War II U.S. global hegemony and the central role of the U.S. military hegemony within that. And it's like going over his head. He's not getting it. And he says to them, he says, "Where's the fucking oil? We've sent, X trillions of dollars in the Middle East. Where's the oil? We should be getting free oil from the Middle East." And they realize, wow, this guy doesn't get it. And I think that's important because it also shows where Trump's coming from. He's not particularly sophisticated. He's not progressive. He's not some sort of peacenik. He's not like, the killing stops here. We're going to restructure America's posture towards the world to be friendly. That's not it. It's just like, transactional sensibility, ADD, doesn't understand history, doesn't understand the big picture. But the point is, he was doing serious damage to American empire. And that is a huge source of profits for many major firms and many very, very powerful people and trusts. And so, what he was doing was highly destructive, and he wouldn't stop doing it. And he didn't get what the big deal was. And if anything, his hostility towards the military, or as he calls it, the national security industrial complex, grew in those 4 years. So I think that's what it's all about, that the ruling class, the elite, they don't see Donald Trump as some sort of a leftist, because he's not. He's a right-wing populist. But they see him as an actual threat to U.S. global hegemony because of his hostility to the national security, the intelligence community, the military industrial complex, et cetera.
And
So I think that's important to understand like everything else. Like, why are they doing this? What is this all about? That's what it's all about, in my opinion.
Yeah, and sorry, before going to RFK, I just wanted to ask about Trump again. And to me, I think it doesn't
Before you ask,
no, just on Trump on this.
yeah,
I
foreign
was gonna
policy.
say
Yeah,
that Trump doesn't seem to be, I mean, just like you said, systematically anti-war or against peace. And I think last time we spoke about your article and I asked you, if Russia-Ukraine was going on, what side would be on? And I think he on that one wouldn't be too much for arming the Ukrainians, but he's kind of, I guess, pick and choose based on how he thinks something will go well for him or not. Like, I mean, there are the examples of where he said he dropped the biggest bomb on Afghanistan, he attacked the Iranian general. But I guess from a US military point of view, just the things that you mentioned are more than enough for them to be worried about his actions.
He didn't start any new wars. He negotiated the end to the Afghan war. The withdrawal happened with Biden, but that negotiation process with the Taliban had to happen. It would have been a much more humiliating defeat for the U.S. had that not happened, had there not been negotiation. I mean, he did not start any new wars.
No, that's true.
Right.
No, that's
and he could have, and even if he did, I think that wouldn't because he could, for some reason, I don't know, something happens that he might just like go to war with one country. Yeah.
But the fact that he didn't, Obama did, Bush
did, is
an
indication.
It's like, yeah.
I would add on Iran, what I find extremely fascinating, which kind of ties well with your, I think, a discussion about the fact that they're going after him. Some people are suggesting that's not the case. Is the fact that when that voice of his got leaked by CNN, he was talking about General Milley pretty much trying to trick him into attacking Iran or as some kind of situation, and he was like, see, I didn't do it. See, guys, see this secret document which I didn't declassify. I didn't go to the war. So, and by the way, nobody gave epsilon of care about that in the news at all. Right. They just focused on the fact that he may have like talked about his secret documents that. I mean, right. It was just
and in that recording, he said, see this, right? He didn't say, see this secret document. He said, see this. And we know that these files he had were totally chaotic, that, there was, news clippings, there were like dinner menus. It is highly believable.
They just ask for everything.
What was that?
They just requested pretty much everything so they can vet it.
Yeah, you just grabbed a bunch of grabbed whatever chaotic files he had. And supposedly he likes to have props. This totally seems believable. And they'll have at Mar-a-Lago like empty folders that say classified lying around on the desk. So guests come in and be like, oh, excuse me, I gotta get rid of this classified file here, It makes sense, right? He canceled the intelligence briefing when he first came in as president. The CIA every morning historically gives the American president an intelligence briefing, and he canceled. He was like, "Get these guys out of here. These guys are like nuts, right?" So, yes, I think that's why. In terms of RFK, well, I'm a COVID skeptic, and I'm totally pissed about how that went down. I mean, I think that is, particularly the way the left dealt with COVID, the fact that the left, I think we've talked about this, throughout everything it stood for, free speech, anti-corporate politics, the idea of agency capture, all this sort of stuff, and just went whole hog in for this stuff. And you've got like right now, I mean, the Democratic Socialists of America just had a conference where there was a vaccine mandate and mandated masks.
This can't be serious. I mean, I remember last time you were on, you brought up a Labor Party something in Chicago or something, and this was already 6 months ago. And you said that. I mean,
August 4th to August 6th in Chicago, the DSA had this conference. I contacted some people on the top of the DSA. I said, is this right what I'm seeing, or is this just people maligning? And the backstory is that the Disability Caucus wanted to have a hybrid conference. They didn't want to have an in-person conference, they want a hybrid conference. They were also pushing for like vaccine and masking at all chapter meetings. It sounded like, or just like a vaccine membership, like for membership you had to be vaccinated, and those things were rejected. But the concession was that, okay, we'll have a vaccine mandate for the conference and mandatory masking, which is incredible. You'd think that they would know that the vaccines don't work.
Can you
They
even
give,
get vaccinated now?
I know. I mean, they
Yes.
give you what,
They
2 to
don't
3
produce
months.
them anymore.
Yeah. I mean, but on the US left, people don't know that. They're totally still into this stuff. So, that's 3 years out. You know, the,
That's good. Yeah.
just the destruction of the COVID lockdowns on school children, on people's well-being, the number of people who lost their jobs because they wouldn't take these vaccines, the censorship, the lying, the consistent lying about the supposed efficacy of the vaccines and of the lockdowns, all this stuff. And none of this was questioned by the vast majority of the left. Far from it. The left was, in fact, the most aggressive cheerleading squad for this whole debacle that there was. And there's been no dealing with that. There's been no reevaluation. And so I think that's a very big deal. And so for that reason alone, I'm supportive of RFK's candidacy, because partly because he drives people so crazy. He drives all the people that I've just lost all respect for. He drives them completely nuts. And I kind of like to watch their reactions as they flip out about him. I don't think he has a chance, unfortunately, because I just don't think they're gonna.
Yeah, his COVID thing has to be, I mean, that's kind of his base, and he makes, I mean, both his base and his popularity, and he makes the most, I guess, coherent sense on that and what he's managed to sell himself best. Besides that, he can get a bit, because I mean, he likes to talk, he's not afraid to talk, and yeah, his interest can get a bit.
Yeah, he says some silly things.
On
yes.
Israel, I feel. On Israel, he's a
he's totally
bit
correct about agency capture. It's like if you could actually address that as president, that would do a lot to restructure medicine in this country. But they're going to do everything they can to stop him. And it's a very unfortunate position on Israel, but I suppose he's wimp-proofed the right flank on that question. In that the left. I mean, Max Blumenthal, Jimmy Dore, exposing RFKs, sidling up to the hard right in Israel and on Israel. I mean, that's seems like, well, who knows? Maybe Democrats are still just going to try and do what they did to Jeremy Corbyn, just call him an anti-Semite, despite all that. But yeah, so that's.
But I mean, I don't think the Democrats would ever need to rely on him. But when it comes to economic policies, though, I don't think they'd have too much problem or troubles with him. At least it seems. If you hear him talk, he doesn't talk about that kind of stuff too much, or healthcare and all that.
He's not a Bernie socialist. No, he's a Kennedy liberal. Yeah.
So I think this brings us pretty naturally to your second article here, how biodefense mercenaries endanger us. So do you want to talk about that a little bit, and the character, who's kind of at the heart of this story?
Yeah,
Daszak? Is that how it's pronounced?
Daszak, who is head of Eco Health Alliance. But this is a very interesting, weird book written by Andrew Huff, who is professor at Michigan State University. He's an epidemiologist. He was in the U.S. military, and he was for a number of years, I think about 3 years, ending in around 2014 or 15, or maybe starting in 2014 or 15. I forget the dates exactly right now, but he did about 3 years as vice president of Eco Health Alliance. So Eco Health Alliance is the nonprofit organization that Anthony Fauci funded, and then it in turn, EcoHealth Alliance, funded gain of function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So Andrew Huff, in this unfortunately not very well written book, I hesitate to say that because I don't want to kick the guy when he's down, but the book is very poorly written. It reads like it didn't get an edit.
You should have asked you to help out because you write very nicely, I must say.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
But I tried to translate like the book because it's really hard to follow sometimes. Huff, who works with Ulsterholm, who was like then becomes Biden's one of his main advisors on COVID, ends up at EcoHealth. He's at Sandia National Labs for a while. Really kind of a prestigious path. So he gets to EcoHealth Alliance. He pulls in a big Department of Defense grant, and he's there for 3 years. But the place is so poorly run and so obviously corrupt that he wants out. And also, he increasingly has conflict with Peter Daszak, who is the head of EcoHealth Alliance. And in his and what's very interesting, among other things, is that EcoHealth Alliance is so poorly run that its employees, at least prior to Huff's book, didn't have to sign, or Huff's tenure there, didn't have to sign non-disclosure, non-compete agreements, all this kind of stuff. Huff was actually free to leave and take some of the ideas that he developed and not opened any lawsuits by writing this book. And he writes the story of this fly-by-night, totally dishonest, nonprofit, but it's really a kind of just, hustle with Peter Daszak at the heart of it. And Peter Daszak also sits on numerous other boards. He's a Brit who now lives in the US, and he's a real player and a hustler. The whole cover story, as it were, the whole purpose of EcoHealth Alliance is supposedly to do conservation biology to prevent spillover events in which diseases in animals can infect humans, right? And this the idea that that the resource frontiers cause this kind of interaction between wildlife and people that leads to the outbreaks of these diseases. And increasingly, some people are questioning that, how important that is. I mean, that certainly does happen, but that's been the main story about this stuff. I mean, that's the main thesis in Mike Davis's book, The Monster at the Door. But what EcoHealth Alliance is really doing, according to Huff, they spend zero on conservation, and that like their main thing is that they're mobbed up with the intelligence establishment, and that they're not, he doesn't say that they are a project of the intelligence establishment. They're very much a kind of organic freelance institution, but that they become part and parcel of a USAID program among several others called Predict, which is about trying to get samples from all over the world and also from other governments and private universities, libraries of samples, right? And so that's what it seems, according to Huff, the whole EcoHealth Alliance relationship to Wuhan was about, and the National Institute of Health's relationship to EcoHealth Alliance and thus Wuhan was about getting access to everything that was going on at Wuhan. The Wuhan Institute of Virology was at that time the most secure lab in China, and it was also a pretty chaotic place. It was really sort of, by some descriptions, like 3 different labs under one roof, and there was Chinese military work going on there. And the key thing in all this also, or a key thing, is the whole idea of biodefense. Vast parts of the population will hear this and be like, bioweapons? What? Oh my God, that's tinfoil hat. That's crazy, right? But I'm not saying bioweapons. Huff isn't saying bioweapons. This is biodefense. In 1972, under Nixon, the U.S. signs an international treaty, and it terminates its bioweapons program. So there might be secret bioweapons programs, but there doesn't seem to be any evidence of that. And all the evidence points to the fact that the United States in 1972 signed this treaty, and then it destroyed its stockpiles, and it ended the programs that were about developing offensive bioweapons and the means to deploy them. However, what happened after that, because it's totally legal, and a lot of people might even argue is absolutely necessary, is biodefense. What about non-state actors? What about states that haven't signed this treaty? What about signatories that might be lying and developing bioweapons of their own? Well, to that you have biodefense. And you can just Google biodefense, and it's not some weird secret program. It's like everywhere. Biodefense is something that the US government talks about openly. There are university units, academic departments, nonprofits, for-profits that are committed to biodefense. And the whole idea is that you try and figure out what might be coming down the pike, what kinds of pathogens might be weaponized, and you try and develop medical countermeasures to prepare against that. And
So
it is
defensive, yeah.
It is defensive. It is not offensive. However, it involves gain of function research on viruses a lot, right? It's like the kind of the nucleus of the science is the same thing, which is like, to take one example, you get bat coronaviruses and you start using CRISPR to slice and dice and see how they might become more infectious to human beings. Why? Not because you want to then build deployment systems and throw them at your enemies, but so that you can then develop medical countermeasures against them, such as vaccines, right? So,
Exactly.
I mean, people, professional managerial class types, the strata from which your average left intellectual and activist is drawn these days in this country, unfortunately, are so extremely, and I think pathetically concerned with their own respectability that it only takes a few words for them to simply shut down. If something if David Remnick of the New Yorker calls something a conspiracy theory, then there are probably about 70% of the people who identify as revolutionary Marxists will turn away from it immediately. and so this whole thing of like bioweapons, oh, that's ridiculous. It's like, well, it's not bioweapons, it's biodefense. Biodefense isn't a secret. It's a thing. It's like,
And
open
that's
your eyes.
not a new
So
trick, by
that's
the
what
way.
that book is about. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, sir. No, that's not a new trick. Sorry to cut you off. It's just that in Iran, at least, we used to have a Ministry of War. Now we have a Ministry of Defense. We don't know. Of course, we don't do war. It's just for defending yourself, you need a lot of missiles aimed at a lot of different countries, just in case.
We had the same thing. In the 19th century, we had a War Department.
Oh,
and
yeah,
then,
of course, yeah.
I forget when the War Department became the Department of Defense, but yeah. So I mean, so that's what that's what recommends the Huff book. I mean, I do think it is worth wading through. And it is remarkable to me that this guy has not been called before Congress yet. Maybe he has, and I miss it, but I don't think he has. I mean, he was right there, and Peter Daszak has some pretty revealing conversations with him. So yeah, that's what that is all about. And there are these programs. I mean, EcoHealth Alliance and the Wuhan Lab, that's just one piece of this global set of programs that encourage gain of function research. And that stuff is really dangerous, as we learned with COVID, because the evidence suggests very, very strongly that it was the bat coronaviruses that were being tampered with in Wuhan that escaped by mistake that are the cause of COVID, right? And there are labs all over the world apparently doing stuff like this. And some of them are in very unstable places. And part of what Huff's book reveals is how even when it's done in the US, because of 40 years of neoliberalism and this 40 years of neoliberalism and market fundamentalism, where like the private sector and competition can always do it better and more efficiently, that plus the concern of the intelligence community for plausible denial that, hey, it's not us, it's EcoHealth Alliance. If worse comes to worse, they can throw Peter Daszak over the side. And I mean, the most he can say is, I had a conversation with a guy who said he was with the CIA, who was interested in some of the stuff we're doing, and they're like, that they can probably shut it down at that. Be like, well, you're wrong. This guy's a mercenary. We've got the books on this. Here's the real story of this outfit. And most Americans be like, wow, these people are corrupt. They're incompetent. This has nothing to do with the CIA. This has to do with a bunch of money grubbing hustlers who funded some crazy stuff and it got out of control, right? So that's great plausible denial for the intelligence services who are, eager to collect samples from all over the world and know what. And the great irony in the whole thing is that, like, so, for a state to defend itself against its adversaries' bioweapons, it's gotten to the point where you're then funding that research, facilitating the very dangerous processes that you're supposedly guarding against. Brings to mind that this guy Toby Rogers, who's a writer, blogger, a Marxist, one of the few Marxist COVID skeptics, had an article in which he coined the term the iatrogenocene. I thought that was good. That's sort of, an iatrogenic illness, if one doesn't know, is when medicine causes the illness, right? So it's a negative feedback loop between health and an illness, health and medicine. And I mean, COVID is sort of, an example of the iatrogenocene.
And what? Sorry.
There are questions, and I haven't researched this, but very reputable journalists a very reputable journalist friend of mine is working on something. I don't know if he's ever going to get it out, but the Ebola outbreak in West Africa in 2014, that was really weird because there was the earlier Ebola outbreaks were all in Eastern Congo, right? And it's like, how exactly Ebola got over to Sierra Leone and Liberia is not clear. And there are labs in Sierra Leone and Liberia that have libraries of samples and do research on diseases. And I believe, the hunch is that they use Ebola. I think there might actually be evidence that they have Ebola samples in the labs. But of course, the entire official structure says, no, it didn't come from these labs. These labs, are safe. But I'm not sure whether it's been proven that they have Ebola samples. But there are labs that have crazy, dangerous disease samples that they experiment on in those countries. So, circumstantial evidence, who knows? But
yeah. And what do you make of? Sorry, what do you make of? Is that a bit strange that two countries such as the US and China, quote unquote, rival countries? I guess that's just normal day of capitalism, and nowadays that they would do research together on something like this. This is nothing that they deny or anything. Who was involved in the Wuhan lab? Is that strange at all, or is that just me being naive? Let's say if the Americans and the Germans were doing that, allies, that would make a lot of sense. But is that just a bit naive me thinking that two countries wouldn't be working on such a thing together? Or even defensively, of course.
Well, it's not official cooperation, right? It's cooperation it's inadvertent cooperation through
finance,
a concatenation, a chain of cutouts, right? So, that's what's going on.
Or like at university.
And you can imagine why the Chinese military might allow an American nonprofit to fund research, maybe certain technology. Chinese capitalism has been built and is still, heavily not dependent on, but gets a lot from foreign investment, right? And one of the things that Chinese industrialization has gained from foreign investors isn't just money, but it's also know-how.
No, yeah.
Right? You bring in engineers, you bring in state-of-the-art machines. And it's like, so you could see by that logic alone that the Chinese military might be like, okay, yeah, it's okay to have shady NGOs. We don't really know who they are, what they are. But if they're going to maybe bring us like the newest kind of gene editing that we don't yet know about, who knows what could come from this collaboration.
Definitely. So, and that's the kind of thing Americans and Biden are complaining about now. And sorry, Sam, just before giving it to you, but speaking of naivety, I think one thing that I was quite surprised at myself, even that I never even questioned is, even for the vaccine, there was a bit more skepticism than the original story of where COVID-19 came. Because within a few weeks, the the thing of, human eating bats and that how COVID-19 emerged, we all kind of took that and we didn't even, at least I did, and I think a lot of people, I never even questioned how quickly you could even reach a conclusion like that. And I mean, within weeks, that was the narrative and everybody was happy with it. So, but yeah, sorry, Sam, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say that, yeah, even if you don't like think that it was leaked within like the early months, it was so shocking to me that everybody was so convinced with like just taking a side on something so fast. It was very surprising to me. That was so I was gonna add that.
I
Yeah.
might have said this in another interview we did, but when the first articles were written about the lab leak hypothesis, one by Catherine Egan in Vanity Fair and another one by what's his name? Nicholas Wade, who wrote a very unfortunately racist book. I think it was called, I forget what it's called, about like, he's one of these people who takes like the genetic
Intelligence.
Yeah.
and physical. He thinks race is real, right? And so he wrote something in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and so a lot of people were like, "Well, anything this guy says, I want nothing to do with." But Catherine Egan in the in Vanity Fair, for whom actually Huff was a source, but she never mentions him. I mean that Vanity Fair reporting was enough to make you think, well, wait a minute, you can't dismiss this out of hand. I mean, it is a pretty remarkable coincidence that the most secure virology, most secure, the only at that time the only BLS-4 biosecurity level 4 lab in China where they do research on coronaviruses from bats. That's the same city where cases of this virus, which is basically identical to the bat sample, except for this spike protein cleavage site, which most of those who know about it said early on, they're like, that looks really weird. Like the chance that this bat virus could have mutated to the point where its spike protein was the one we find in coronavirus without anything else in the virus also mutating was just statistically impossible. And so that made it look like that looks like it was edited, right? I mean, all of that and the geographic nuances, I mean, that alone, you got to be like, wait a minute, this lab does need to be looked into. So I told several lefties about this, like, hey, just read this Catherine Egan article. And, I had, people say, no, I'm not going to do that because I think it'll just feed into anti-Chinese hysteria, right? Which was a talking point that came directly from Peter Daszak. When the lab leak, when the virus starts, rampaging out of control, late 2019 into 2020, January 2020, Peter Daszak, Ralph Barrick, who's a big gain of function researcher at UNC, Anthony Fauci, others, they're all on these emails, which have now been made public through various lawsuits and Freedom of Information Act requests. And they're all debating this, right? So, and then it's in response to that Peter Daszak organizes a letter that's signed by top virologists, which is to say gain of function researchers, and it's published in Nature, and it basically says, well, if it doesn't say explicitly that entertaining the idea of a lab leak theory is racist, but it gives you that impression that it's kind of like that you're kind of racist if you're going to blame the Chinese. And then Daszak also heads, he doesn't head, but he basically organizes and is among the top people on the WHO's investigation team that goes to Wuhan. And that investigative team, led by, in large part, Peter Daszak of Eco Health Alliance, produces a report that is so flimsy that the head of the WHO, Tedros, says, well, this won't do. We're going to have to look into it more. But anyway, yeah. So a number of prominent leftists that I know just said right out, I'm not gonna entertain this because it seems racist, because that guy Nicholas Wade is a racist, and because nature
Because
has
because eating bats in East Asia is not a racist trope at all. That's not a racist trope at all. Or eating
that's a good
weird.
point.
Yeah,
I don't know.
that's a completely normal.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
I think maybe I don't know if this is one of the same authors, but I think this was fictional because I remember at first when the lab leak came up, people would also reference this. I think it was a fictional book talking about how things like this are going on in 10 years. So that was also kind of used in order to kind of dismiss this theory, but I can't
Right.
even
Well, there was a
remember.
movie.
Contagious, you mean the Soderbergh movie?
No, it was a
That was
book, I
like
think. Sorry.
With
But
Brad, not that, it was no, it wasn't. I read some. There
Gwyneth
was a,
Paltrow.
I think there was a. I just read one reference to this somewhere. There was a one season streaming show like right before COVID that was basically like the whole kind of
Oh wow,
tablet that vaccines. I don't know. You know, I mean, they've been. I mean, yeah, that's all.
castrated.
There's a culture of biodefense, and all these games, like the Event 201, all these kinds of things. It's like, these are the sort of things that people can latch onto and think like, wait, this is a massive conspiracy to depopulate the planet. It's like, I don't think that's what it is. First of all, I think more people would be
It's
dying.
corruption.
But I think it is, I mean, I think it's what it appears to be, which is like it's the
Yeah.
culture, biodefense, plus plausible denial, plus neoliberal, subcontracting gets you this kind of chaotic stuff. And then, of course, there's, as part of this crucial event in all this, is the anthrax attacks of 2001, right? Like right after 9/11, there's several packets of envelopes of anthrax are mailed to various people. And it's determined that that anthrax comes from Fort Detrick, Maryland, which is the traditional home of American kind of like biodefense, well, previously bioweapons, but now biodefense research. And how it got out of Fort Detrick, we don't know. But after that, there was a whole government press on biodefense. We got to take this seriously. Next time the terrorists might not be flying planes, they might be using anthrax or whatever, right? And so obviously, with this very open, not secret and hidden, though there are secret parts of it, but this very open culture of biodefense, there are regular war games, tabletop exercises, conferences about it, and they're discussing all sorts of scenarios that would justify their medical countermeasures, i.e., their vaccines and their, it's mostly vaccines, but also various other types of medical countermeasures. So, then you look back at, oh my goodness, is this all some giant conspiracy? Did they plan this? I don't think it is. I think it was, this crackpot Dr. Strangelove, national security wing of the national security state, and that this virus escaped because the lab was shoddily run and the subcontractors / cutouts are a bunch of scoundrels and self-dealers and incompetents. And that ultimately we're very, very lucky because there are, according to Senator Rand Paul, who knows a bit more about this, I think, than, he has security clearance and can see stuff the rest of us don't see. But he said in several interviews that, there were viruses in there that have they estimate 15% mortality rates. I mean, COVID is at first the infamous Niall Ferguson at Imperial College London, who got mad cow so wrong, said that he projected, I think it was like a 3.5% infection fatality rate, which would have been, very, very deadly. But, you can debate it. John Ioannidis of Stanford, who's really a leading scientist on this stuff, he puts the fatality rate at, like a bad flu, basically. It's well below 1%, right? So, I mean, can you imagine if something with an actual 15% infection fatality rate? I mean, many of us wouldn't be here. So, but the sad thing is we're not having a real conversation about this, right? It's just we're having left versus right nonsense. And my impression is also that the Republicans are mostly posturing on this, that they want to use this to beat up on the Democrats, but they're not interested in. I mean, some of them are, few here and there, but they're not really interested in going up against the national security state.
No, certainly. So I don't know, Sam, if you had any other questions on this topic, but since I'm a bit mindful of time, I really wanted to go to your Peter Turchin false
Yeah, go
prophecy
ahead. Yeah.
article, Christian. So I mean, I really much enjoyed this because I mean, kind of a little bit of guilty pleasure, but it kind of seemed like Peter Turchin. I didn't actually know about him for reading this article. Maybe I'd heard of him, but didn't remember. It's kind of one of these natural science quantitative scientists who thinks that with that he can just apply it to everything and predict everything in life, kind of. I mean, I'm sure I'm a bit butchering it, but yeah.
Yeah.
So this book, End Times, is getting a bit of traction, and I was actually asked to write the review because I don't think I would have read the book otherwise. And
Because you
it's, I
kind of
think,
knew what he was going to say, kind of thing, or what? Why were you hesitant, or
because I think
what?
it's a bad book. I
Mm.
picked it up, I saw it at the airport, and
Oh, okay,
if
that's
I
a
had seen
sign.
it or not, yeah, if I no, but nothing against having books in airports. One of my books was once in an airport.
Oh, okay, well, accept that one.
No, but it was like, if I picked it up in an airport not having already known about it, I think I would have leafed through and be like, I don't know, that seems kind of like silly. But the reason I don't like it is because Peter Turchin started out as a theoretical biologist trying to predict population dynamics for plants and animals and life forms. He gets tenure and he moves on to questions that are normally handled by the social sciences, and his main area of focus is sort of the collapse of civilizations and the causes of revolution, this sort of stuff. And he uses, unfortunately, he still uses his mathematical modeling to answer these questions. And that is problematic in a number of ways. One, because it just takes up a whole bunch of space. He's busy justifying his mathematical model.
Oh,
Also
oh my
because
God.
like limited, I mean, you have to reduce the total, the complexity of history to
A few
variables.
indicators. Yeah.
Yeah, variables that you can plug in again and again for each case study, and then run your regressions to figure out what's the key variable. It all strikes me as very pseudo-scientific. And at best, he comes up with the same kind of interpretations that people already were coming up with, but in the process telling much richer, more dynamic stories. But the problem is that because of scientism, because of this cult of the scientific method, this reification of the scientific method into this thing, a lot of people fall for this. Like, and Peter Turchin's mind says, I'm not, these aren't my theories.
Right?
Like,
Yeah, facts.
yeah, this is objective truth. This is what Crisis DB, the crisis database, has told us. And he's helped start a subfield of this kind of history called cliodynamics, not to be confused with cliometrics, which was in the 1970s, particularly in US history, was a branch of US history that tried to basically just add up information to come up with definitive answers. I'll say about slavery, sort of like what was the role of what were the role of economic incentives versus physical terror, these kinds of things. I mean, it wasn't about running huge models and predicting the future. And cliometrics was controversial enough. But so cliodynamics is about like trying to model history and project forward. And so in this book, End Times, Turchin argues that the key variable is elite overproduction. That when you have mass immiseration plus an elite overproduction, then you get social conflict because this inter-elite conflict then can weaponize the misery of the masses, and then you get civil wars and this sort of stuff. And he doesn't do a good job of defining elites. He doesn't do a good job of defining what a surplus elite is. It's just, I think it's a bunch of mumbo jumbo.
And
I mean,
that's
what he's right about is that there's tremendous inequality, and that's destabilizing,
Yeah, exactly. So charitable read of it is kind of that, okay, he reaches not really surprising conclusions, but in a way, he in his attempt to be objective, he kind of leaves out a lot of depth that other people bring in and has to generalize definition and things like that.
If I just may be really frank though, I just really enjoyed this article, and I just have to say this type of, I despise them, and I don't know why they allow like natural scientists to write about this type of stuff. Just before I'm gonna ask my question, but before that, if anybody's interested in climate's effect on politics, they should read your book. Tropical Cancer is pretty much very similar, I think, themes.
Yeah.
So
Tropic of Chaos.
Chaos.
Though I
Sorry.
would say, I have one regret about that these days, which is I think I'm a little too kind to climate modeling in that book, and that rely. I mean, I have a line there where say like, they're not perfect, but they've been more wrong than they've been right. And that's true. They're not perfect, and I guess they've been more wrong. They've been more right than they've been wrong. That's what I meant to say if I mess it up. But they've also been wrong in pretty significant ways, and those are important to note. For example, one, we're days away from, I believe it's the 15th anniversary of the Hurricane Katrina, and I covered that for The Nation. I arrived in New Orleans on the third day, just, the 82nd Airborne was just arriving, and I wrote a bunch of pieces about that, and I'm pretty sure in every one of them I worked in, and there's gonna work. We know there are going to be more frequent and more severe hurricanes landing. Well, that turned out to be wrong, and I was saying that because that's what the climate scientists were saying, and the climate scientists were saying it with total certainty because that's what their models said. And now they realize, okay, our models were wrong, and they have a new explanation for why that hasn't happened, even though their assumptions were that as the ocean water heats, there's more energy in it, there's going to be more hurricanes, they'd be more intense, right? And there are, I mean, all those assumptions are correct, but for other reasons that have to do, they now say, with the heating of the surface of the land, and then the wind pushing off the land and driving hurricanes that form back out to sea. In fact, fewer hurricanes are landing, right? So they were wrong about that. So that doesn't mean climate modeling is totally wrong. And I'm not saying in any way that climate change isn't real. We can just observe that. You don't have to theorize that. I mean, you just measure that. It is real. It's happening, right? So now not to make too big a deal of the models, but just that I think the problem that I was not aware of in that book is that I think that the scientism, the fetishization, the reification of science into a kind of secular theology, and so, well, the climate models show that the world is going to end in 13 years, that this has actually been debilitating for the left, for environmentalists, for
100%.
climate activists. And I actually, that's something I want to write about. This kind of like living, the fact of the matter is, we know that the situation is bad and it's getting worse. Okay. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. There's all sorts of weird variables. Okay.
Yeah.
But to foreclose the future is to foreclose on any kind of progressive politics. And I've only come to realize that in the wake of this COVID insanity. And it's like, I see the nihilism of these young, politically minded people. And I feel really bad about having inadvertently contributed to that with a perhaps too glib sort of like, hey, let's not knock the climate models, which is like, I mean, I'm not saying the climate models are worthless. They're not at all worthless. They're what we have, but we can't be like, they're, the climate model gods. Don't offend the climate gods. Do exactly what they say. It's like, because if you do that, you're gonna start thinking that, like AOC, that you shouldn't have children, that there's no future, then who cares? If AOC isn't gonna have kids, why is she in Congress? What's the point?
No, and I mean, at least the climate scientists, they put out like 5 scenarios, which is like scenario, like this is like the scenario 5.
Yeah.
But I mean, you're right. I mean, I think although the public seems to forget stuff pretty quickly, I'm coming to think at some point people are gonna be like, and a lot of people are like, okay, like 10 years ago you said it's gonna be catastrophic. 20 years ago, I mean, you said it so many times that I'm not forgetting about it. And I mean, now what? I
I mean,
mean,
exactly. I don't recall what you're talking about, the fact that they said there's going to be more hurricanes, but I remember from my like very young childhood, there was always a doom and gloom. We have about like 5 years, guys, 5 years, and we are done. And it was like, it can be that, like, I mean, it's just, yeah, it's too much. But
I mean,
just, I was, sorry, go ahead.
I mean, there's you could a counter argument is that, like, global capitalism with its tendency towards boom and bust and crisis and regeneration through catastrophic warfare. I mean, it's the apocalypse has sort of been ongoing for 500 years. If you look in the right place, you can find the apocalypse.
Exactly.
So.
So I just had two questions about this about this guy, and one of them was that does he, like, when he talks about the elites, does he reference at all the literature, like C. Wright Mill or anything? Like, does he like pay lip service to the existing literature? And the second question was, do you think there is a problem with the lack of international or political economy in the British sense? Like, nobody does that anymore, it seems. The idea that sort of a macro international political economy. It feels like they just want to do this, what, scientism, modeling, whatever it's called.
I think, yeah, there is a real shortage of that. I'm trying to remember. I thought the same thing about Mills, and because I forgot, I'm going to look. Does he have Mills in? He does not have Mills in the index. I think he
Jesus.
does not mention
No,
Mills. Yeah,
it's like
yeah. I had
Wikipedia has
in the
Mills
draft
on
in
it.
the draft of the thing. I had a point about that, about how his version of elites was, was very akin to Mills's power elite with his, because so which
Okay, was
your
okay.
comment brings up, like, Turchin's definition of elites, which is people who wield one of four kinds of power, which is coercive power, violence, economic power, bureaucratic power, and the fourth, ideological power. And that's where it gets kind of slippery, because then, in ideological power, you're not talking about influencers,
yeah,
freelance
like a quarter of
journalists.
the population at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
bro.
so that's his key category, elites. And the whole thing is that there aren't enough, seats. The number of elite aspirants grows, but the number of posts for these elite aspirants doesn't grow commensurate. And so he doesn't make any attempt to prove that. He resorts to analogies about, musical chairs. He uses like
Yeah.
fictionalized biographies. He invents a MAGA Trumpian guy. He invents like a
God
Occupy
damn.
Wall Street veteran who goes to law school. It's like, I mean, just like an immigrant couple. The guy is like Eastern European tech titan. The
This
white
is like
Latin
this is the
American and the liberal. It's like, you're like, what? This is like, this is
this is the
nonsense.
shit they do in marketing. They create like a persona, a perfect customer, like a Latina that is bisexual and
Yeah.
is rich also. So yeah, it's, oh, wow, okay, crazy person, basically.
Yeah.
But
And
yeah, all
so,
right, yeah, that was it.
and I mean, of course, and I don't remember when this made it in. I don't know, it's a long piece, but I mean, of course he would have, if he'd gone and found a real Steve. Steve is the gun-loving MAGA working class guy, or real whatever. It's always so much more interesting and weird when you find the person. You go, well, here's
Yeah.
the person who's the archetype, and it's like, yeah, but except they're like an individual, and they're going to be weird, and in history, and people are like that. So yeah, and part of what's infuriating about this book is that he commits the crime that Marxist historians and political economists were always accused of during the Cold War, which is being mechanistic. I mean, this is so mechanistic. There is no role for chance. He doesn't explain, like, personality, I'm just on and on these various, the variables of geography and this and that. And that was always the thing that was said against Marxism. Oh, it's mechanistic. When in fact, it's not. I mean, there are mechanistic, believe me. Yes, there are mechanistic versions of Marxism, but classical Marxism is has many faults, but being mechanistic is not one of them. It's dialectic and pretty nuanced and generally quite empirical, particularly that kind of British historically minded political economy. He also really, he has no account of the rise of inequality. So sort of the main thrust of his argument, the meat and potatoes of it, is rising inequality in the United States, and he doesn't present any explanation for that. And there's a pretty good literature on that. So I try to give a summary of what happens, right? And what happens in a nutshell is that you get the Great Depression, which it could be argued, and there's still debates about this, but it could be argued that there's a crisis of overproduction plays some role in that. That leads to a crash, which leads to political polarization, a global crash, political polarization that leads to war that destroys all this means of production and resets the whole process of accumulation, right? That inadvertently takes care of the problem of overproduction. So then, the US goes into World War II, the New Deal, to deal with this crisis, empowers labor, creates a structure that will in the future allow for the Great Compression, as it's called, when American class inequality, decreases. You then have the tremendous stimulus of World War II and the Reconstruction, because the war destroys enormous amounts of wealth that then has to be rebuilt. And so for a generation after the war, the US in particular, but also other, the other two key poles of global capitalism at that time, Europe, Western Europe, and Japan, can afford a kind of mass prosperity, because back to the American situation, there was enough profits there was enough growth and enough profits being made that American corporations could afford to pay high taxes, pay high wages, submit to growing levels of expensive regulation, and still book healthy profits. And they were able to do that because this process of rebuilding took so long. By the mid-1960s, Japan and Germany have recovered. They have rebuilt their industrial base using the latest technologies. Their wages are lower, and they are no longer just working to supply their own markets, but they're beginning their export offensives. And by the mid-late 60s, you begin to get signs of glut, signs of overproduction. And in the United States, once rare luxuries like a full-sized refrigerator and a color television, by the late 60s, early 70s, even poor people can have these, right? And it's like, so the demand, the post-war demand starts to slow down, and you get classic crisis of overproduction. Capital, big business, tries to push back and scrape back a larger share of the output from workers to restore profits. And I should say that average after-tax profit rates dropped by about 2/3 between 1966 and 1973. And that trend line, you have to imagine what that was like for the ruling class, right? I mean, the story is that it then, bottoms out and then recovers under Reagan. But, while you're on the way down, these guys are getting scared. Like, where does this go? So,
yeah,
big business is attempting to claw back money, wealth from workers, i.e. to cut their wages, get them to work harder for less. And they can't, because people are too radicalized, organized labor is too strong. 1974 sees more work stoppages than any year in the US since 1953, right? There's this massive labor offensive in the US. And the 1970s are such an interesting decade in the US, in part because there's this class deadlock, and the working class cannot be brought to heel and broken. And that expresses itself to some extent in a wage price spiral. Business raises consumer prices, but then labor unions are able to, compensate with increased wages. And you also then have stagflation. You have stagnant growth, yet rising prices. And this is finally addressed in the second 2 years of the Carter administration, when Carter appoints Paul Volcker as chairman of the Federal Reserve, and he promises to beat inflation by plunging the economy into a recession. So in Interest rates were about, I think they were around like 9% in the late 70s when Volcker comes in around 79. And he by 81, he has raised them, or in that, yeah, by 81, he's raised them to over just over 20% 3 times the federal funds rate. This has the effect of plunging the US economy, which was then the largest economy in the world, into the worst recession since the Great Depression. At the same time, Carter loses the election. Reagan comes in. He fires the Air Traffic Controllers Union, which was the only union that endorsed him. 11,000 of them go, or no, I think it's 13,000 of them go out on strike. He declares the strike illegal. A lot of them, because there hadn't been massive privatization yet, a lot of them were direct federal employees, and he can also, use federal law to control even some of the private workers. He fires 11,000 of them. He arrests the head of the union is arrested. So it smashes that strike. And this is a message to organized labor that the gloves are coming off, stacks the National Labor Relations Board with people who are totally hostile to labor, cuts taxes on the rich, begins massive deregulation, massive cuts to public spending on health and human services, education, housing, all this sort of stuff, increases military spending. And all this has the effect of bringing down the share that goes to wages and the working class, and increasing the share of output that goes to profits, and thus restoring profits for the ruling class. And it unleashes a wave of turbo financialization. Financialization, in turn, leads to deindustrialization. As firms merge and rationalize, that means they get rid of, they liquidate, and inefficient units, and they export to low-wage areas from the unionized Northeast to the non-union US Southeast, and then offshore, right? So there's deindustrialization. And that is the beginning of Reaganomics, of what we now call neoliberalism. And that's the story in a nutshell of why class inequality in the US then just like begins to, yawn open again with, that kind of solid middle class that had been developed by the New Deal and through the post-war boom. A portion of them rise up into the ranks of the nouveau riche, a small portion, and many of them fall down into destitution. And then those who remain in that middle class, the professional managerial class in particular, become, I argue in the piece, leaning on Barbara Ehrenreich, actually become quite conservative in many ways, including the liberals who read the New York Times. Those are the PMC people who were basically supporting really draconian, I would say, ultra authoritarian policies around COVID, right? And so Turchin is saying, well, there's not enough chairs in the game for the elite aspirants, and so these elites are going to lead a revolution. I mean, maybe, but first of all, they're not even elites. Who he's really talking about, or you're talking about these downwardly mobile professional managerial class folks, right? They are, in terms of strict Marxist, classical Marxist political economy, they're workers. They sell their labor to survive. They don't own the means of production. In that way, they're unlike the old petty bourgeoisie. They don't own a little store. They're not a sole proprietor, accountant, or lawyer. They work for some big firm. And if that firm fires them, that's it. They have no ownership claim over that firm, right? They do. And as that class becomes more precarious, Ehrenreich argues, they actually they identify increasingly with elites. And they become increasingly concerned about falling. And I think she's right. I think that class is, if anything, has become more reactionary than ever. And we're now at a point where we see a right-wing and a left-wing version of that. The right-wing version of the precarious professional managerial class are freaked out about immigrants, and they're freaked out about poor people of color, and they've got those old kind of right-wing law and order politics, right? They're the people who like eat up the stories about mass shoplifting and chaos and all that sort of stuff. And on the left, the cultural left, those same people are totally obsessed with deplorables and how the interior of the country, particularly the US South, is like a no-go area full of violent, dangerous rednecks, which is like wrong, So, so say in that article, but yeah, the Turchin book is wrong. Now, there could be instability in the future. There may be, but I end the review bringing in a variable that Turchin doesn't theorize at all, which is the state. Do you think if you write about revolution and state failure, you should talk about the state? You should, you should think about what this institution is, right? And the U.S. state, I argue, having studied it my entire adult life, I mean, that's the through line in all the books I've written, is state power. The U.S. state is incredibly powerful right now. It has, I mean, I think it has qualitatively more and different kinds of power than it had even in 1980. I mean, from the number of SWAT teams everywhere to the kind of surveillance, the new sort of censorship that's developed that we've seen only coming out of COVID, with collaboration with the tech companies. I mean, this is a very, very powerful entity. And a credible attempt to predict the future would, I think, have to deal with that variable. So, I mean, if Trump is jailed and if there is, more and more undeniable evidence, if the mainstream of Biden's, corruption, if the mainstream feels like, wow, our brands are really going to suffer if we don't admit that there are some facts here, and they have to then sort of, acknowledge this story. And there's credible questions like, the head of Burmisa. Well, I'm interrupting myself here, but here's an example of something. Right? I mean, there is an FBI document, this form, I think it's called FM 1023. 1023 is a number, I forget what the numbers are, the letters in the beginning, but this 1023 form from a confidential human source that the FBI describes as reliable, that they've been working with for 10 years. This guy is an American businessman in Ukraine, and he reports to the FBI on conversations he's had with the head of Burmisa. And the head of Burmisa is complaining to this guy about the bribes that he's paid not only to Hunter Biden, but to Joe Biden. He claims that he paid $5 million to Hunter and $5 million to Joe Biden. No, that's not proof. That's just somebody saying this. But it's weird that the FBI withheld this and refused to release it. Somehow Senator Chuck Grassley, a Republican, got it from them and released a basically unredacted version of it. So if stuff like that comes out while Trump is actually in jail, there could be some crazy stuff happen. But call me cynical, I think that the national security state, the FBI, the ATF, these agencies are more than a match for any kind of turmoil, that any kind of violent upheaval that would happen. So, I mean, I think the real risk is a deepening of a kind of, authoritarianism of the center. That's one of the real risks we face, due to growing immiseration plus political corruption, not like this whole elite aspirants and there's not enough games, not enough chairs for the musical chair game. I mean, that
yeah, I can't believe musical chairs were involved. Apparently, he gave a metaphor analogy using that. Apparently,
yeah, it was.
And I mean, this is an idea that comes from, sorry, but I mean, theorists and historians of Third World Revolution have noted this in the past. I mean, Olivier Roy, a theorist of political Islam, used this to some extent. And there are examples, and I give Turchin credit for that, for being correct about, like Egypt, there are examples in some cases in the global South where you can say there really is this kind of overproduction of the professional class, and they do then sometimes become revolutionary leaders.
But that's just one symptom of what you described, though. That's just like literally one symptom of the declining rate of profit. There's not enough spaces, basically. There's not enough place to grow. Yeah. So, I mean, it was, literally was like all the 1,000 pieces you read about the Iranian Revolution that have the most basic and the most like shallow like analysis. Oh, there were a lot of people being educated and there weren't enough jobs. Well, we all know that. I mean, yeah, it was. Yeah, it was a pretty, I think, and I loved your history of neoliberalism. Would you agree that a lot of people, even who are critical of capitalism, tend to just basically say that neoliberalism came about because Reagan and Thatcher were evil and they wanted to like destroy workers. They never like go into a analysis that you went that basically the economic climate changed.
Luckily, I'm too
Yeah,
young to have heard that. So.
the declining the profit crisis. Yeah,
Yeah, basically. Yeah.
yeah. I mean,
A
well,
lot of people are
I
just
don't read
like
those people. That's
Reagan.
kind of my, I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, it's like, David Harvey, who I did a series of postdocs with, has been very good on this for, his whole life. And that's where I got it from. Not his whole life, but his, in for decades. And
Academic.
yeah, I mean, yeah, you may be right, but when it's an account of neoliberalism and they don't get into the profit crisis, that's sort of like one of the things that I look for in a book. I'm like, are they hip to this? Like, or is it some sort of vague, ahistorical moral argument? And if it is, I'm generally probably not going to read that too closely. I might kind of read it strategically for other things, but I'm not going to read it for its overall theory. I might, but
No.
generally had not found anything to replace that explanation. I think that the profit crisis is why the regime. I mean, there's the regulation school of political economy in Italy. It comes out of Italy. That was that talked about how there's like regimes of accumulation, as they put it. That capitalism has to have an ensemble of institutions and also sort of cultural norms, like to facilitate accumulation, and these regimes can rise and fall. The American version of that, associated with the University of Massachusetts, an older iteration of the University of Massachusetts economics department. A lot of my colleagues at John Jay got their PhDs at the University of Massachusetts, was called the social structure of accumulation model. And it's the same. It's basically the regime school without using their language. But the reason that the regime of accumulation that Harvey calls embedded liberalism, whatever you want to call it, this regime of accumulation that comes out of the New Deal in World War II, the reason that is so profoundly restructured at a global scale is because of the profit crisis, right? It's not because of a bad attitude. It's because there was very serious threat to the thing that is most important to the investor class, and that is profits, right? And they were okay to go along with all of these compromises, and they believed all these post-Keynesian economists, for a full generation. But then when, the financial statements, started having like declining numbers, it was like, this isn't working, man. And something's got to be done. And then they push against labor, and they realize, whoa, like organized labor and also unorganized labor, just workers, are empowered by these macroeconomic stabilizers, right? And they're like, this isn't in the Turchin essay, but this is I've written about this elsewhere. I mean, I think the quintessential example of this is there's a strike against General Electric in 1969 into 70, and the workers win. And General Electric had the toughest labor management of any of the industrial firms at that time. They really prided themselves on this. Bowlerism, it was named for this guy Bowler, who was their HR guy or labor management guy. And they do an analysis after the strike, and they realized that a lot of these union workers who went on strike were not only getting the strike pay from their unions, which is money that the workers have paid into a fund and that they then get back during the strike, but that they were also, due to liberalized laws, collecting unemployment. So thanks to unemployment insurance from the New Deal, and then thanks to the liberalization of laws around unemployment during the war on poverty and the social movements that were dealing with poverty in the 60s, thanks to all that, they realized, so these workers are actually collecting unemployment while they go on strike against us. So from their point of view, they're thinking like, so we pay taxes to the federal government to subsidize these guys while they like jam us up when we're trying to restore profits, which is like in their minds, like, their due right and what they have to have to blah, blah. And it's like, it's that causes that class to go from being like, oh, the economists know what they're doing, and we've got it all figured out, and the business cycle's been tamed, to being like, wait a minute, we're ready to break things and totally like throw out the old rules and redo this. You know,
No, certainly. And it's a great piece. You don't get into all of these things in there, but yeah, no, definitely a great piece. I don't know, Sam, if you have any other questions you want to ask about this or anything
No,
else.
just you can find the pieces in Compact magazine, by the way, all three of them, which is, I think we've become an unofficial sort of advertiser because we've had three writers from Compact magazines on. So
who were the other writers?
Jean Bajelon and Douglas Lane. So I mean, Jean Bajelon, you may know, he's historian, but I don't know about Douglas Lane.
I'm gonna look those
Oh,
interviews up.
Douglas Lane, you might have heard of him
Oh,
too.
thank you.
I've
He's
heard of
the
Douglas Lane. I read his.
Sublation
Oh,
Media.
okay.
He's
Yeah.
the editor of Sublation Media, if I'm not mistaken.
I read his piece in Compact, and I looked at Sublation Media. I may have read the other person, but their name didn't lodge in my head. But
yeah, Jean Bajelon also went to LSC, like you and me, kind of. But
oh yeah, you went to LSC. Yeah. Good old
Right.
LSC. Yeah. Well, it's
Yeah,
a pleasure talking with you guys.
Thank you, Christian. It was
Thank you.
really great. And thank you for joining us again. And thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you in our next video. Thank you.
Thank you.